Thank you all for joining us today. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to talk about John Marshall's life at home for this webinar. My name is Jennifer Hurst-Wender, and I'm pleased to be Preservation Virginia's Director of Museum Operations. The home John Marshall had built for his family in Richmond in 1790, and where he lived until his death in 1835, was acquired by the city of Richmond in 1909 with the intent to tear it down and build John Marshall's High School in its place. Thanks to a very vocal public outcry, the house was saved from demolition and managed by Preservation Virginia, which at the time was called the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, or APVA. It opened to the public in 1911 as a historic house, and since that time, the high school has been torn down, and in its place stands the John Marshall Courts Building. In 2005, on John Marshall's 250th birthday, the city of Richmond gave Preservation Virginia the deed to this historic landmark. Preservation Virginia celebrated its 135th anniversary in February of this year. We are the oldest statewide historic preservation organization in the country, and in that time, we have continued to work to ensure the relevancy of the Commonwealth's historic places. We own and operate the John Marshall House, Patrick Henry's home, Scotchtown, Bacon's Castle and Smith's Fort Plantation, Cape Henry Lighthouse, and historic Jamestown. Our statewide preservation initiatives have led us to preserve John Marshall's birthplace, the Hollow, advocate on behalf of the Randolph Masonic Lodge, where he was the Grand Master, and assist with the preservation of the church that he helped construct, Monumental Church. The multifaceted and impactful nature of our advocacy programs, our 6 historic sites, and partnerships with other organizations has allowed us to create a holistic approach to saving the places that connect us all to our diverse and complex history. I hope that if you're not already a member, that this program, our preservation initiatives, and our many other programs at our historic sites will inspire you to become a part of Preservation Virginia. At the John Marshall House, we're fortunate enough to be surrounded by an enormous collection of Marshall objects, including the house that he had built. Almost 50% of everything in his house belonged to him and his family. Because of this, we have a pretty good idea of his personal taste, strong, simple, stylish, and often local. It'd be a good idea for me to go back and build up how and why Marshall's home was constructed in the most fashionable neighborhood of the new capital of the Commonwealth. On September 23, 1755, John Marshall was born to Thomas Marshall and his wife Mary Randolph Keith Marshall at a small cabin in what would become Fauquier County. He would be the first of 15 children born to the couple, all of which survived into adulthood. The Marshalls would move their family into the Hollow with 2 rooms on the first floor and 2 in the loft above on the banks of Goose Creek in Leeds Manor, which was part of Lord Fairfax's land. At the Hollow, John would grow as a frontiersman, educated by his parents, transcribing Alexander Pope, and reading the classics from his father's library, as well as from some believe the library of Lord Fairfax. He studied at school for a year alongside James Monroe at the academy run by the Reverend Archibald Campbell, and then another year with a tutor, Reverend James Thompson, who was sent from Edinburgh and who lived with the Marshall family. In 1773, Thomas Marshall had Oak Hill constructed on his own 1,700-acre estate, 10 miles from the Hollow. Well, this home was yet another story-and-a-half cottage, but it was double the size of their previous home, with 4 rooms on the first floor and 3 above. It was from Oak Hill that Thomas Marshall and his oldest son John would join the Culpeper Minutemen. They would fight in the Battle of Great Bridge in buckskins embroidered with Patrick Henry's "Liberty or Death" in white letters. Marshall's time as a soldier would continue as he fought for General Washington of Brandywine under General Morgan's elite rifle regiment, the Virginia 11th. This unit was composed of frontier sharpshooters. Marshall spent a harsh winter in Valley Forge, and it is said that this harrowing experience profoundly affected him in his political beliefs. Eventually, he would become one of the young nation's leading Federalists. But as a young rifleman, his fellow soldiers remarked that he was the most cheerful and optimistic man they knew, never complained, and was an inexhaustible font of anecdotes. By the end of 1779, Marshall had been furloughed from the army and trekked down to visit his father, who was commanding the state's artillery regiment in Yorktown. In anticipation of John's arrival, a ball was thrown in his honor by the Ambler family of Yorktown. Thomas had been reading letters from his son John to Jacqueline Ambler, his wife, Rebecca Burwell, and their 4 daughters. Anticipation to meet the accomplished soldier was high, but instead of the dashing war hero that was expected, John was lanky, awkward, and unpolished. Just shy of 14, Mary, known as Polly Ambler, was not taken aback by this backwoods captain like her sisters appear to have been. She was smitten with a 25-year-old war hero. For the next 6 weeks, he stayed in Yorktown, and he took up every opportunity to spend time with the Ambler family, reading them poetry and introducing them to authors they had not yet heard. In May of 1780, Marshall enrolled at William and Mary and began studying under Chancellor George Wythe. His fellow classmates included Bushrod Washington and Spencer Roane. It's worth noting that Wythe notoriously scheduled the most difficult work early in the day. Marshall excelled as an early riser, and throughout the rest of his life, he would most often wake before sunrise for a brisk walk to begin his day, and return for breakfast before others were even awake. By August 28th of 1780, he had taken his oath and was formally admitted to the bar in Fauquier County. Now, growing restless without a client base due to the war, he walked to Philadelphia to rejoin the army, as was his typical method of travel. He traveled 30 to 35 miles per day. During this voyage, we get an insight into one of the many times that Marshall is misidentified. So the first hotel that he found after 2 weeks of travel actually turned him away because of his shabby clothing and unkempt hair and long beard. Resigning his commission in February 1781, he returned to Richmond, where the Ambler family had moved to the new capital of Virginia, after Jacqueline Ambler had been made treasurer of the Commonwealth. John took up courting Polly, engaging in politics, and running for a seat in the Virginia legislature. The story of John's proposal to Polly is legendary. When he asks Polly to marry him, Polly refuses. So John says goodbye to Polly, he mounts his horse, and he heads for Oak Hill. Weeping inconsolably, Polly cuts a lock of her hair off, and she gives it to her cousin, John, who rides after her suitor. So catching up to him, he hands over the lock of hair. Marshall turns around, rides back, and asks Polly again, and this time she says yes. So Marshall has this particular lock of hair placed into a gold locket as a wedding present for his bride. And she wears the locket until on her deathbed, where she removes it and she gives it to her husband. And he wears it. And in his will, it's stated that this locket is to be the last thing removed from his body after death. It's said that the locket represents a poem, the lock of hair represents a poem that we are pretty sure both of them are very familiar with, The Rape of the Lock by Alexander Pope. Their wedding was held in the cottage in Hanover on January 3rd, 1783. So the couple sets up their first rented home in the capital of Richmond. Well, this is before Jefferson's capital was constructed in 1788. And the town's population is around 1,200 people. There were approximately 200 dwellings. Almost all of them were wooden, and the streets were dirt and mud. And the General Assembly was meeting in a warehouse that was also used for dances and banquets. In love but poor, the newlyweds rented a small residence on 4th and I Street. And I Street would eventually turn into what we now call Marshall Street. Only a few months prior, Edmund Randolph granted John Marshall the use of his chambers, and yet again, another anecdote of our often misjudged Marshall. So a man was in search of legal services and newly arrived to Richmond. He heard that Marshall's services as a lawyer were highly recommended. However, after seeing Marshall's slovenly manner of dress, he decided to seek another services. So whilst in the courtroom, he saw another case in which he was actually able to witness Marshall's profound skill against the lawyer that he had already obtained. When the recess came, the man approaches Marshall and explains that he had already obtained the services of the other lawyer for $95 and he only had $100 with him. But asked if Marshall would take on his case for that remaining $5. Marshall agrees and adds this wonderful story to his repertoire. In those early days, it could be said that Marshall's closest friend was James Monroe. Having been schooled together as boys, and they shared quarters at Valley Forge. They were both elected to the House of Delegates in the same year, and they were both young lawyers. So after the Richmond's proceedings, the two of them often went to Formicola's Eagle Tavern on Main and 15th Street. They would drink and play cards and billiards, and they would go to see traveling acting troupes perform whilst in town. Marshall was an avid theater goer in a time when theater was considered rather indecent. In 1785, John Marshall receives the deed to both his lot on 9th and I, and also the title to the family home Oak Hill. He stated that it was his plan to spend summers in Oak Hill and winters in Richmond. It is at this time that John's father moves his family permanently to Kentucky. Now, as the family passes through Richmond, John's two youngest siblings are dropped off to live with the young family. Thus, the household grows from John and his pregnant wife Polly and their infant son to include two more children. It seems that they move into an existing dwelling on that Richmond lot to save money until they're able to begin construction of their two-story brick home in 1788. And their house wouldn't be completed until 1790. So it's during this time that John's law and political career are booming. His account books reference an uptick in the purchases of food and wine as he prepares to entertain during the 1787 Virginia Ratifying Convention. Most of the delegates, including Madison, Henry, Pendleton, and Mason, stayed at the Swan Tavern. Now, its location was directly across the street from John Marshall's home. And while Marshall's fine brick home had yet to be completed, he did his fair share of entertaining. Gouverneur Morris and Light Horse Harry Lee amongst those known to have dined at the Marshall household. It has been said that Marshall's greatest contribution to the ratifying convention may well have been a balance to Patrick Henry's affability in Richmond's public houses. The neighborhood that Marshall moved into was known as Court Inn, due to its proximity to the Capitol, completed in 1788. His next-door neighbors were his in-laws, the Amblers, and other neighbors would include Edward Carrington, Daniel Call, William Wirt, John Wickham, Spencer Roan, John Brockenbrough, president of the Virginia Bank, Thomas Nicholas, and Dr. Fouché. In 1798, on 5th and Gray Street, just a few blocks away, George Wythe moved into town. And with a penchant for cold showers, the neighbors often heard him catching his breath and almost shouting with the shock. The 1795 Mutual Assurance plot lists the house, a laundry, a smokehouse, a barn, and a kitchen, and a law office on the lot. So now we're going to talk a little bit about John Marshall's involvement with the Quoits Club. And I'm going to read to you an excerpt from Richmond in Bygone Days by Samuel Mordecai. Blair and Buchanan were important figures in the Buchanan Spring Quoit Club, which began functioning the last decade of the 18th century and continued well into the 19th. The meeting place was on Buchanan's farm in the shade of great oaks, just beyond the present Hancock Street and near the 1000th block of today's West Broad. On Saturday in spring, summer, and fall, some 30 of Richmond's leading citizens gathered there. The cool springs on the property was notable for its translucent purity, and the shade of the huge trees made it a place of restful quietude. The area then was beyond city limits. Wine, for some reason, was prohibited at the meetings, except on special occasions, but julep, punch, or toddy were regular features, together with porter and ale. The meals were of monumental proportions. They were consumed on a pine table covered by a shed under the masterful ministrations of Jasper Crouch, retained originally by the Richmond Light Infantry Blues, who recognized his ability in roasting pigs, mixing punch, and performing other culinary rites. Crouch presided over the club's gastronomical activities for many years. The Blues, founded in 1789, were given special privileges at the Buchanan farm. All right, so here is yet another little bit of a description of the Quoits Club. This says that lunch, set on a long trestle table under a rough frame structure to shield against the sun, Marshall and Wickham, the caterers, had lunch served at 12:30, each one at the head of the table. And a spit-cooked pig seasoned with mustard, cayenne, and Worcestershire sauce was always served along with punch, which was later a mint julep, but in the early days consisted of brandy, rum, and Madeira, sweetened with sugar and lemon. No water save ice would be added. It's also said, and I'll quote some more from Mordecai's Richmond in Bygone Days, their handsome 32-gallon punch bowl of India china was spectacularly featured on their outings. It also mentions that the Buchanan Spring Quoits Club, their members regularly consumed an astonishing array of meats, fowls, fish, eggs, vegetables, salads, cheeses, and fruits, all washed down with assorted potations. It was natural after such repasts that the sated gentlemen wished to relax. And quoits came next for those who were partial to that sport. John Marshall and Parson Blair were generally the leaders of the two contesting teams, and all other players used highly polished brass rings. But the Chief Justice, with his usual lack of ostentation, had heavy, rough iron rings, which he hurled with great dexterity, in an effort to ring the peg, or come as close to it as possible. And for those not interested in quoits, conversations with politics barred was the order of the day. Such raconteurs and wits as William Wirt and John Wickham and Benjamin Watkins Lee were particular stars here. So with Marshall's political career growing, he was at home in Richmond less often. But when at his new home, he would host his famous lawyers' dinners monthly. These lavish affairs were a coveted invitation to the most prominent male figures in Richmond for that month. Multiple courses and political discussions were a continuation of the conversations that Marshall became famous for during the ratifying convention. Beginning in 1800, Bushrod Washington shipped all of Washington's papers to Marshall's Richmond home. Writing Washington's biography would consume all of Marshall's free time when he was not sitting on the bench. By 1806, Marshall was writing the final of the 5-volume biography of Washington. He and Polly had fallen into the rhythm of spending their summers in Fauquier at Oak Hill and their winters in Richmond. And we're going to talk a little bit about Polly. While vivacious earlier in their relationship, Polly's health began to fail before their brick home was even completed. She had lost 2 children in 1792 and had never quite recovered from the melancholia. By the time John Marshall was tasked by President John Adams to be an envoy on his only trip abroad to represent France to Talleyrand in what would become the XYZ affair, Polly had had several miscarriages and was 3 months pregnant. They quarreled bitterly, but he went to France anyway. During that time, he wrote her often. It seems that she only wrote him 1 time in return during his absence. She did give birth to a healthy John Marshall Jr. in 1796. When he returned, she was bedridden both from physical and mental melancholia. She never quite recovered from her ailments and recused herself from the public from that point on. It seemed that her illness only made John more tender to his wife, and it is said that no one wore shoes in the house when Polly was home, and that the Chief Justice would quiet the neighbors' dogs to protect his frail bride. She would be carried out of the city by John and placed gently into a carriage on parade and festival days. This led to John Marshall being more responsible than the average man to the details of keeping a household, including shopping, which he did daily at the 17th Street Market. In 1835, John Marshall passed away. At that time, the house is deeded to his daughter Mary, who rents it out, and eventually it passes on to John Marshall's granddaughters, Emily and Mary Harvey, and then to the city of Richmond, and finally to Preservation, Virginia. Now, one of the objects that's never really left the house is John Marshall's Supreme Court robe. Conserving John Marshall's robe is one of our top priorities. As such, we have enlisted the services of Howard Sutcliffe. He is the principal conservator at Richmond Region Costume and Textile Conservation. He is a textile conservator based in Montgomery, Alabama, and after training at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, he's worked at several institutions on both sides of the Atlantic, conserving objects as disparate as the Taraz fragments from medieval Egypt and Tsar Nicholas II's parade uniform to Kermit the Frog. Marshall's judicial robe is the most significant surviving artifact documenting his extraordinary judicial career. In 1801, during the first session of the Marshall Court, the newly appointed Chief Justice wore a plain black silk robe in contrast to the scarlet and ermine robes that adorned his fellow justices. By the next year's session, all of the sitting judges followed Marshall's example, wearing plain black robes. This modest act set the stage for the rise of the federal judiciary as the final interpreters of the U.S. Constitution. Only one robe survives from Marshall's 34 years of service as a U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice, and they are in need of conservation. After being on constant display for decades, the robe has deteriorated due to the black dye used to color the garment. And without your help, this important national artifact could be lost forever. We hope that you'll donate to the Save the Robes project for the conservation, documentation, and stabilization of the original garment, and a custom-built, climate-controlled archival case. We'll also produce 4 reproduction garments that can be displayed or even worn. And when the robe returns in its case, we'll want to put it in a really great exhibit. So we hope that you will donate to the Save the Robes program, and if you are not yet a member of Preservation Virginia, we hope that you will sign up. After this webinar is completed, I will be around to answer any questions that you may have, and I look forward to talking with you. Thanks.